I'm just going to say a couple of words by way of introduction. The first thing I'm going to say is that I'm a scholar of French, and in French we say venez nombreux, and you have, there are loads of you here, which is fantastic. I'm Shirley Jordan, Professor of French Studies at Newcastle University, and I'm also co-director of the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing, which is hosting this seminar this evening. And it's brilliant to see so many people here. I want to thank Jasmine and Katie for having organised a really great trio of events around the issue of care, which of course is so topical and so live and so important. So one of these has happened already. That was Care, Geopolitics and the Social. This evening we have Care and the Non-Human, and then there is a third seminar as well, Care and Neoliberalism, which will take place on the 28th of March. And they're part of a sort of suite of events that the Centre's curated concerning the questions of care during the month of March. And we're absolutely delighted to have them. And I'm just going to hand over to you now because you've got a lot to get through.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shirley, and thanks again to the IMLR and the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing for hosting this wonderful, our wonderful speakers. So as Shirley mentioned, today is our session on care and the non-human, and we've got two amazing speakers for you, Iggy Cortez and Jamie Weinstein. So I'm going to get straight into introducing Iggy, as we've got two speakers this week, huzzah. And so here we go. So Iggy Cortez is Assistant Professor of Cinema and Media Arts and English at Vanderbilt University. His articles on filmmakers such as, oh dear, Apichatpong Weerasethakul, Claire Denis, and Lulu Wang have appeared or are forthcoming in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Camera Oscura, and the edited collections Faces on Screen, New Approaches. He was a co-curator of the exhibition Itinerant Belongings at the South Foundation with Charlotte Ix. He is currently at work on a book on nighttime in world cinema. Iggy is going to be talking, giving a paper entitled Aunting as Attunement, the Auntie in World Cinema as Oblique Axis of Care. Over to you, Iggy.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And let me see if I just in the nick of time it came. Okay, so I think everybody should be able to see my my PowerPoint, hopefully. Great.
Yeah, that's perfect. We can see it.
Wonderful. Without further ado, I'll get going. In what follows, I want to propose that the aunt or auntie emerges not only as a prominent figure in recent global art cinema, but that she frequently serves, more pointedly, as the very embodiment of global art cinema's specific sensory and aesthetic orientation to the physical world, an orientation that frequently works to displace a sense of the world centered around the normative human. Let me begin by briefly glossing on global art cinema's generic parameters, its displacement of linear narrative, its accentuation of cinematic images exceeding narrative motivation, its attention to liminal and uneventful time. In films by Tsai Ming-liang, Mati Diop, and Apichatpong Weerasethakul, our perceptual surrogates and anchors into the physical world are often aunt-like figures, women who inhabit oblique, tangential, and non-prestigious modes of kinship, and are thus aligned with art cinema's attention to phenomena and temporalities that deviate from established grammars of visibility and value. Aunting, therefore, is not only a mode of intergenerational care, but also a form of criticism and a proprioceptive register, a means of describing art cinema's perceptual affirmation of the physical world that cultivates queer and non-normative modes of recognizing human and more than human interrelations. My particular focus today will be Apichatpong Weerasethakul's Cemetery of Splendor, a film primarily concerned with a mysterious narcoleptic illness afflicting a group of soldiers in Khon Kaen, a city in northeastern Thailand. As we will later discover, this disorder cannot be reversed, as the soldiers' energies are siphoned into a parallel realm where kings are engaged in an endless battle. As Kong Wiki has remarked, this allusion in the film to monarchy, national mythology, and military force invokes a propaganda of nation building that has licensed intensified culture and political surveillance across Thailand. In a certain reading, sleep in the film symbolizes the passive acceptance of the government's abuses through a rhetoric of national exceptionalism, the belief that it is the king's transcendent authority that has protected the nation from direct colonialism and continues to insulate it from destructive forces. At the same time, however, the film traces a phenomenology of slumber to reveal the roots of an absolute self-possessed subject, multiplying the figure of the narcoleptic soldier to unsettle a notion of the body politic as self-sovereign and contained. Scene after scene, the soldier's sudden fall into slumber create flusters in the city's public sphere, leaving vague but lingering impressions of something anomalous in the air, alerting us to a force that exceeds human frameworks of understanding. In one scene in a canteen, for instance, a soldier falls asleep on his plate. The splat of his face on the food encodes a disobedient revulsion towards the image of former dictator Sarit Tanarak, whose portrait looms unremarkably in the background. In order to cast dissent against his government as a threat to the core forms of Thainess itself, Sarit aligned his regime with a cultural revival of the king's eminence, positioning the monarch as a symbolic father whose image united differences of class, language, and regional identity. Writing in 2007, Tak Chalamitiarana observes, quote, Thai politics even today is just one step removed from despotic paternalism, and the possibility of a political relapse demands that we seriously contemplate its past meaning and form, especially the likelihood and implications of a future adaptive resurrection of a paternal rule. I want to defer a more intuitive engagement with the film's central trope of slumber, however, to discuss how the unruly presence of the narcoleptic bodies call attention to the film's remapping of familialism, particularly as the nation's prevailing frame for public culture and national building. As the citizens adapt to the soldier's sleep, the city's rearranged rhythms give rise to intimate but also indeterminate bonds between the film's central protagonist, Jen, a middle-aged volunteer caretaker, and two younger characters, It, one of the narcoleptic soldiers, and Kang, a medium who is able to communicate with their dream realm. Jan is played by Jinjir Pongpas, an Epishapong regular who has appeared in most of his features and who is frequently referred to in both the narrative and extra-narrative worlds of his films as Auntie Jen. Through the film's focus on Jen's social presence, I want to suggest that Cemetery of Splendor displaces a paternal and implicitly atavistic idiom for national public culture with an affective orientation towards aunts, or what Eve Sedgwick calls the avunculate, the quote, process of making visible aunts and uncles, end quote. In Thai, there are two terms for aunt, pa and na, which are liberally and almost always used to refer to any older woman, even beyond one's own immediate family. The aunt label thus serves as a sign of respect or deference, but it also reflects a notion of the public sphere as a community of intimate bonds, united by shared investment in the nation. In Sedgwick's view, quote, having aunts and uncles, even the most conventional of aunts and uncles, means perceiving your parents as somebody's sibs, not, that is, as alternately abject and omnipotent links in a chain of compulsion and replication that leaves inevitably to you, but rather as elements in a varied, contingent, recalcitrant, but reforming seriality, end quote. Thus, by dislocating conscious and unconscious investments in paternal and even maternal supremacy, the symbolic queerness of aunts and uncles bypasses their individual relationship to nonconformity. Jan herself actualizes this term in ways that are highly particularized, as she registers as both normative but also queer in her distance from social norms of valorized recognition. Throughout the film, she oscillates between a radically unguarded acceptance of the unfamiliar while remaining staunchly devoted to national patriotism. In keeping with the iconic image of the auntie, she's a conduit to local traditions, gossips, and superstitions, and is religiously devout after making merit at the temple. But less conventionally, she's also an older disabled woman who shares her sexual wants in an offhand manner, casually affronting cultural biases that can only imagine the young, reproductive, or able-bodied as legitimate desiring subjects. And most significantly, her past and present marriage defines her social presence less than her elective connections with younger friends. There is a parallel we could make, therefore, between how the soldiers sleep and the aunt, and the way that the aunt rearranged the symbolic and affective commons of the nation. The sleeping soldiers trouble the public sphere's sustained atmosphere of benign ordinariness from within its very structures of governmentality. In a similar way, Jen, as auntie to the nation, lays bare the psychic and affective burden of social anomaly, while nonetheless identifying with and being sutured within its punitive norms and institutions. As a symbolic device, Jen's embodiment of auntiness evinces how the relational ties that underwrite the social are electively lived, even within existing cultural scripts. There are few socially enforced or deeply felt norms that impose what an aunt's relationship to her nieces and nephews should look like. That is to say, as a node within kinship structures, the aunt is not discursively locked, unlike the symbolic plenitude normally attributed to the place of the father in rivalrous and idolatrous relations alike. In supplanting the father as a film's grounding metaphor for the social, the aunt recasts understandings of the public sphere as something dynamically indeterminate rather than singularly sovereign, and also permeable, I want to argue, to the animist world. Through her embodiment, the national commons cannot be viewed as a timeless ground linked to an unconditional, unchanging symbolic source, but it is conceived rather as an open field of variable relations, reflecting, in other words, a vision of the public underwritten by notions of contingency, instability, and openness. I further want to suggest that aunting exemplifies a mode of care that continuously expands beyond the notion of the normative human, such as the protractedly sleeping soldiers she cares for. As a repository of traditional beliefs and an interface between different generations, Auntie Jen serves as a lens for the film's animist approach, what May Adidal in Gawanage describes as a conviction in, quote, the permeability of human and non-human worlds, the relevance of animism to the theme of cinema beyond the human lies in its conception of the self as porous with respect to a multiplicity of life forms, end quote. For example, as a mode of reconceived publicness, aunting relations organize one of the film's most sensual and visually striking scenes in a night market, where it, the sleeping soldier, attunes himself to the material immaterialities of his environment. The scene unfolds in a continuous static shot that situates their intimacy amidst the ebb and flow of the city's urban nightlife. While it and Jen are situated in the image's foreground and serve as its clear fulcrum, they also appear slightly off-center, as if to underscore that their relational tie, while far from secret, stands at a remove from fully recognized forms of intimate alliance. The scene's dynamic composition underscores the sensory surround that frames the emergent and atypical intimacy between it and Jen as enjoyable, fulfilling, but also as a distinctly public mode of association that is permeable to the non-human world. After awaking from his deep sleep, in fact, it finds his senses radically heightened towards atmospheric phenomena that exceed human cognition, telling Jen that he can feel all the temperatures, smell all the foods, even the flowers outside of their reality and in a parallel realm of dreams. In observing it and Jen in the night market, we are invited to expand our perception into a space of sensual sociality analogous to its own heightened sensibility towards such elusive atmospheric phenomena, but also akin to the life world encoded in the modest pleasure of sharing a meal with an aunt-like figure, an experience akin to what Jose Munoz describes as an encrypted sociality that might inhere in a, quote, quotidian act that signifies a vast life world of queer relationality, end quote. The affective indeterminacy between Jen and it attunes us to the nation's discursive construction and potential reconstruction in another pivotal moment, in which questions of place and history are approached from the scale of the spectral rather than the normative human. During one of its narcoleptic episodes, Ken, the medium, invites him to transfer his consciousness into her body. In this way, it can perceive both planes of existence simultaneously and proceeds to give Jen a tour of the royal palace he inhabits in his dream state. This otherworldly sphere subtends the very space in which Jen and Kang find themselves, although in a parallel dimension, invisible to the human eye. While we never see this realm directly, we learn of its lavish scope as it points to where its myriad luxuries stand in relation to the visible environment, the strange environs of an economical sculpture park designed by a queer artist, Banlu Sulutat. This park has incited the irritation of the Thai government for synthesizing Buddhism with foreign influences of Hinduism and Laotian folklore. The incommensurability between what it describes and what we actually discern underscores this excursion as an allegory, political allegory, laying bare how the imagined splendor of sovereign origins is projected into the park's arid landscape and its strange and weathered statues. The disjunction between the palace and park derealizes the hallucinatory ideal of a unified Thainess, an ideology grounded, as its descriptions make explicit, in the idealization of the monarchy's immemorial endurance. But I want to suggest that the scene achieves this derealization not only through an insistent attendance to the sculpture's material objecthood. By establishing the crown's coercive appeal as an immaterial dream, pro-filmic space supplants the tour's petrifocal orientation to kingly authority with an attunement to the enigmatic character of the sculptures within their natural ecology, such as their presence and material history that exceed the scale of a human lifespan. Cumulatively, these sculptures disclose a hybrid system of belief that continuously diffracts any formalized framework of cultural commonality. In other words, the park setting does not displace hallucinogenic dreams with critical wakefulness, but it supplants it rather with an appeal to a more capacious relation to fantasy and the world, one that is not escapist or dissociative, but rather responsive to the historical realities of the region and also more than human dynamics. For Apishapong, in fact, the pavilion is a manifestation of revolt. He interprets the sculptures as allegories for, quote, homosexuality and poverty that are perceived as negative traits, like being born in the Northeast, end quote. In this way, these sculptures aggressively project positionalities that are linked with social negativity and which are therefore in conflict with resurgent appeals to an essentialized Thainess, undermine their symbolic reliance on and reproduction of traditional kinship, social hierarchies, and religious and cultural homogeneity. Even the material decay of the sculpture structure changes the site's design over time in ways that exceed human control, setting the stage for unprogrammed uses and reappropriations by both humans and the natural world. In other words, while grounded in historical consciousness and cultural tradition, this cosmological garden proposes a mode of social assembly in which the idea of the public is positioned as a perpetual becoming, catalyzed not only by metaphysical concepts of fluidity or untrammeled volition, but rather by the contingent force of material entropy and the unpredictability of historical and ecological developments. At the end of their tour, Jen and It, who is still in possession of Kang's body, find a bench in a secluded area of the park. Here, they repeat their conversation in the city's night market. I can sense every smell here. I can feel the temperature of the lights, etc. This reprisal invokes a specifically nocturnal mode of perception that enhances non-ocular capacities like smell, taste, and touch that are not as firmly linked to mastery or knowledge. This allusion to a sharpened sensory acuity is conjured in the same spectral and virtual register as the king's palace, informing the scene's subsequent staging of an illegible spectacle of enigmatic intimacy. Here, Jen offers It a mixture of herbs in the hopes that its curative effects might extend to his narcolepsy. But instead of drinking this concoction, he kneels in front of her and begins to lick the liquid he gradually pours over her leg. Jen begins to sob, although the affective valence of her tears in response to It's gesture remains ambiguous. What It's licking communicates seems indeterminate, and it remains similarly uncertain whether Jen's tears index feelings of social dispossession, or rather an overwhelmed sense of relief for the recognition and repair attributed to or potentially misrecognized in sex or sex-adjacent acts. Given the citations Apichatpong routinely implements across his film, the sight of licking invokes a pivotal scene in his earlier tropical malady. In his own reading of this moment, he says, quote, "I wanted this queer couple to kiss for the nation," end quote. Here, the rezoning of kissing from mouth to lips to skin resonates with what Arnica Furman will describe as Apichatpong's, quote, reframing of queer personhood as ordinary, though not obedient, and as socially central, though not assimilated, end quote. The affective intensity of this intimate act, the way it errs from, but nonetheless orbits on the periphery of sex's recognizable forms, manifests what is already imminent in a hermeneutics of aunting. As we have seen, aunts exist, but are also structurally subordinate within social imaginaries of national unity, whose legitimacy relies on the resemblance to familial structures and their correlating arrangement of visceral attachments and identifications. I want to propose in closing that licking here serves as a metaphorical conceit expressing how aunting relations, in their lack of prescriptive determination, offer new plots of intimacy and modes of connection. They achieve this by anomalizing the familial matrix in which they are simultaneously enframed, as if to set the stage for the invention of future social rearrangements. Lasting over 5 minutes, the scene here accumulates sensory details from the pro-filmic environment, particularly non-human sounds, linking the unfolding of our rapt bewilderment to the scene's evocation of place. In this way, the scene does not just situate us as passive onlookers to Jen's leg being licked. In the process of beholding this enigmatic and irreducibly ungraspable expression of desire, our perceptual relation to the scene is projected into Kang's roaming tongue. Licking mirrors and calibrates our contact with the scene as our perception remains on the image's surface in the same way that the tongue skins Jen's scarred skin. Its flickering movement suspends the tongue's normative functions. It does not connote what Diana Fuss calls the ingestion model of identification, nor does licking here allow the tongue to stick out in a gesture of derision. Here, licking's oblique expression of intimacy seems to threaten intimacy itself with illegibility, rendering it dangerously proximate to animality and the random, indiscriminate motility of bodily drives. For Mel Chen, in fact, licking has its origins in a forbidden sexuality, as it registers a simultaneous, quote, fantasy that not licking is a viable way to contain the interconstitution of people and other people, or people and other objects, end quote. As an analog to our sensory congress with the screen, the tongue's intense but unfixed movement communicates the intimacy and fluidity between spectator and image, while also keeping their ontological distinction and irreducible alterity in place. Licking affirms the complexity, vagueness, and opacity of the object of its wet regard through a gesture suspended between distance and assimilation, sensory absorption, and relaxed awareness. Moving across these registers, its tongue ratifies Jen's carnal presence and the verities of her injury, while also dismissing the need to situate these coordinates and the marked subjectivities they signify into a fixed system of representation. The scene does not propose a specific alternative for social legitimacy or intelligibility. It connects the fundamental indeterminacy of several juxtaposed terms, from aunting relations to the communicative uncertainty of lapping, to the overriding question of a counter-public culture, or the material immaterialities of the physical environment that are all invoked by the park's heretic flamboyance. In this context, the park's resistance to sanctioned discourses of nationhood allegorize the aunt as an alternative geobody for the nation, supplanting the enigmatic figure of a paternal king and its image of the social as closed, transcendent, and atavistic. The scene insists that Jen's metaphoric reflection of public culture does not reside in her bearing or the particularity of her character, but it is encoded in the variability, open-endedness, and contingency of aunting relations as such. Throughout Apichatpong's films, these relations are conceived and approached as cross-generational modes of connections steered by choice and inclinations, more so than obligation. In this way, the peripheral standing of aunts within kinship structures induces attention towards familialism's support of despotic authority, while gesturing also to seemingly intractable orders as formal designs that can be susceptible to repatterning, or in animist terms, permeability. Like Aunt Jen, aunties reroute the underlying identity of the public sphere and the physical world as something dimly conceived, like the equivocal intimacy of licking, an enigma whose captivating splendor is also that of an underlying uncertainty. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Iggy. I'm going to join everyone in applauding you. And thank you so much. That was just amazingly illuminating and wonderful. And I'm sure that we'll have loads of discussion afterwards. Hopefully we'll have time for that. And I know myself, I've got a few little questions I'd love to ask you to hear more about that. So thank you so very much. We are at time now, but Jasmine, should we take one or two quick questions? And if obviously if people have to leave for other commitments, then no worries. But should we just see if there are a couple of questions we could very, very quickly share? Now, feel free to put them in the chat for Iggy or for Jamie, or raise your hand, and we'll just give people a few seconds to kind of formulate their questions. It'd be great to hear from you guys.
I might start with a question for Jamie, perhaps.
Please do, yeah.
And I was just interested in, as I was listening to your talk, because of, I'm wondering if I can ask a question on Leo Bersani, who died recently. And Leo Bersani would not necessarily be a figure who we think of as somebody who kind of inhabits kind of discourses on the non-human. But I was reading a piece by Sarah Ensor, who's thinking about Sam Delaney and kind of cruising and the non-human and questions of ecology. That Bersani again came to mind when you were talking about a certain kind of, I think the way you described it was a sort of oscillation between indifference, but also kind of care in some way, and a certain difference and sameness, these kind of oscillating registers. And I'm interested in the way in which so much of, when I was listening to that, what echoed with me was this kind of Bersani sense of a kind of sameness that can actually accommodate all of these different differentials, these kind of different variations that, because of the way in which they're multiplied, no longer seem like a difference, but there's actual variabilities become a certain condition of a kind of condition of allness. The condition of being is actually the particularity, such that particularity is no longer an index of the different, but becomes rather the means of participating into an ecology of allness. And if that sounds a bit abstract, it's just something that I was thinking of in relation to how you're working with this notion of indifference.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I do address some of that sort of later in the paper, where parts I did not read, where I talk about I asked the question, how might indifference ethics attend to the issue of marginalization, oppression, or those that are entangled with speciesism? Because, of course, the marginalized or the oppressed other in the assemblage has no way of escaping the devaluing effects of difference there, right? So I wondered, because I have in the published work that I've done around this, I take aim at object-oriented ontology, where basically everything from a burrito to a Boeing 747 to a lesbian to feminism to Black Lives Matter all has the same status, right? Either an event or a thing or whatever. And there I say that, you know, ethics requires some sort of decision about who or what we regard as valuable, and our world is never given in a flat manner, contrary to those theories that try to capitulate a flat ontology, right? But it's always specified within an event or an assemblage, and specified from a position of what or who we deem to be worthy of consideration. So therein lies, I would say, in effect, the oscillation, as you called it, between sameness and difference, or seeing difference differently. Seeing difference in this Deleuzian sense is not difference from some norm or some barometer, but seeing difference in itself, right? As not a relation, but difference in itself. So there, I guess there could be resonances with Bersani, or even, and certainly with other people like Lee Edelman, or with Jose Munoz, in thinking about futurities and temporalities of queerness, you know, depending on which way you go with it, that indifference could get embedded into some of those kinds of understandings of queer temporalities, or in Afrofuturisms, for example. So I think that there are ways that this, like spinning difference differently, and then also seeing ethics from that foundation, rather than seeing ethics from care or as a kind of posture toward some other. Because then that immediately values as unequal or equal. If you're caring towards someone, it puts someone in a position that's unequal toward you immediately, just by virtue of the care, because it's also assuming a certain vulnerability and assuming a certain precarity or fragility of the person who needs care, right? And I'm not saying that, I know that there's a lot, I mean, I studied with Virginia Held also back in CUNY when I was doing my PhD in philosophy. So I've had like a lot of background in those kinds of like analytic feminist ethics of care. But those always draw off of these ideas of precarity, vulnerability, and neediness, which then in effect put you in an unequal position right away, even if we want to ethically see that unequal position as morally obligatory. So I want to start from this position, like you said, from this kind of more mixed, crazy, abstract position of seeing sameness and difference differently, which again plays off of my epigenetic research, which I have no time to discuss here, but that's what I'm trying to formulate through the framework of epigenetics, that our differences from not only each other but the world are very murky, in the sense that, you know, who we are as this entity is only a result of an interaction with our ancestors and our ancestors' relation to world and our own relation to world, and that it can't be separable. So yeah, I hope that answered your question in some form. And yeah, apologies for being so abstract.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And did we have any other questions from the chat that anyone wanted to add there? I know we're slightly over time, so we've lost a few people.
I could ask Iggy a question back.
Yeah, if you'd like to, absolutely, please do. It's really nice to see this dialogue.
Yeah, I found your talk really interesting, and I have to confess that before hearing about it, I knew that you were talking about anting, and I had no idea what that really meant. But of course, there are all these sort of queer kinship relations that in people who do queer kinship research, you know, to think about how we could sort of care differently, or how we could have form families differently, and anting would be a really nice position from which to start that. I was just wondering how you saw that in relation to care. I mean, is it just about changing our focus from the kind of traditional cis heteronormative family kind of kinship relations, or is it about like upsetting the notion of care as located in that like pre-formulation?
Thanks. No, I think that's a great question. And I arrived at aunts because I was writing a book on nighttime, and I found that most of the films about nighttime that I was interested in were not necessarily about kind of Oedipal reproduction, right? The way that timescales always play themselves out in dramas about, you know, night as a space of transition. But it was rather a kind of oblique axis, that there was always a kind of a figure of an aunt-like figure in different kind of different cultural contexts. It is work on world art cinema. And I think what interests me about the figure of the aunt is it's twofold. On one way, it is mostly a kind of structural rethinking about what counts as eventful time. And I think that's what interests me about the relationship between cinema and the figure of the aunt, is that particularly something sort of marginal, sort of oblique, but also ubiquitous and a bit, you know, kind of there, but also not particularly valorized as a kind of kinship mode. There's something about the status of the aunt that, and what a kind of art cinema does, in the way that it kind of luxuriates in these kind of non-eventful, non-progressive, you know, representations of time, that seem to me to kind of interrogate, well, what counts as meaningful time? What counts as important labor? What counts as recognizable labor? What counts as, you know, time well spent or time meaningfully spent? What is kind of anointed? So there's something about it that is kind of boldly, kind of like broadly structural. And in terms of a kind of orientation towards care, what interested me is, I think, and I was really interested in what you're saying about the kind of relationship between care and carer, because aunts, of course, are kind of considered these people who sort of watch over, but not always. Oftentimes, kind of relationships between aunts and, you know, nieces and nephews can be quite conflictual. This is to say that it is a kind of relational node where it seems to me that there's no prescription about what the relationship between a niece and nephew and an aunt or uncle should be like, right? And it's actually this kind of open-ended, continuous interrogation of what is happening within this dynamic that seems to me to be the kind of provocation and interesting thing about this nonetheless intergenerational mode of orienting people orienting themselves to each other. So in some ways, the younger generation is as dependent to the aunting relation. That's why I emphasize aunting and not just aunt, as it is the other way around. And somebody in chat also pointed to Critical Auntie Studies, which was a conference that took place, I believe, at Tufts that happened. There's, I think, also a new kind of interest in aunts from different kind of cultural perspectives. So definitely check out the links in the link that Ted just provided.
I also just wanted to point out one funny thing about thinking about aunts, especially in this kind of queer way, is that in really awful evolutionary biological theories that try to explain homosexuality, often the explanation, because evolutionary biology, right, at least in its most unsavory forms, is trying to justify how the species continues, right? And if homosexuals are not considered to be reproductive, at least at the time of these theories, then the question of like what their role is, or like how are they evolutionarily made sense of since they keep being reproduced, is always extra care, right? It's like additional care for the infants, so or for the young humans that are going to be spawned by heterosexual couplings, right? So they're supposed to, because apparently, you know, young humans need so much care to age, to become mature, that they need extra care from the gay aunts and uncles, right? So when I first heard about your talk, I was thinking that it might go somewhat in that direction as a kind of reclamation project of that very spurious theoretical perspective that all we're good for as homosexuals is to be extra carers of the future species, you know, the species continuation.
I was actually going to ask about that because I work a lot on childlessness or non-mothering, and so this idea that as this being who, well, in a lot of studies it shows, you know, often childless people are pitched as kind of against the social or in some way anti-social, but actually they end up doing a lot more labor for the wider community. And so I was really interested in knowing if you, with the aunts that you look at, which is a kind of maybe not exactly close to the talk, but I was interested in knowing that are the aunts figures having their own children? Where do they sit in that kind of reproductive kind of valuation? I'm just really interested in that.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's really, I mean, I love both of those kind of observations. And it is absolutely, I think, this idea of aunt as an ancillary care, right? Like this, they're there to kind of take care, you know, as kind of support care. But what is so interesting to me about plots about aunts and uncles is how often, you know, the care they provide is often disinterested or deviant or like actually not care at all. Like they're just like, I'm not your mother is a kind of traditional kind of refrain in a lot of aunt plots. I was like, you know, go, you know, I'm not, there's a kind of relinquishment of any sort of, you know, duty, but nonetheless, there's still some sort of dynamic. And in the and the film that I was actually talking about, Auntie Jen does have her own children, actually, but it's less important to her social standing than her, this kind of lateral movement that she's inhabiting. And I think, you know, I'm approaching this also through different cultural contexts. So in this case, it's in Thailand, where the notion is that, you know, she's a woman, must be in her 50s, everybody becomes an aunt, right? After you hit a certain age, right? It's not that, you know, even people who are, you know, have done the right thing, right? There's a way in which aging queers everybody, and that you will kind of inhabit this sort of, you know, this kind of marginal, tangential, you know, position in which you're kind of expected to kind of care for everyone, but everybody also knows at the same time that aunts also don't really care about their nieces and nephews, or they're there if you give them something back. You know, there's also a mutual, you know, you have to do something for them as well. So there is something that also almost as a kind of temporality that also awaits mothers, shall we say, who have their own children. It's a social identity that awaits everyone, if you will. So there's a way in which aging becomes a kind of, you know, a pathway to a certain queered positionality, whether or not one recognizes it or not, at least in the context of Thailand.
That's so interesting. I was just thinking about how that, I was thinking about two things, one which is maybe slightly academic and one which is definitely not academic, which was in the recent Netflix show Love at First Sight. One of the one of the contestants described that it was like going out with his auntie, i.e. he didn't find her sexual, he didn't find her sexually attractive, and this was bound up with kind of an internalized sense of like shame about his own kind of Indian heritage and actually having like chosen a kind of an Indian woman, that this was bound up then within this kind of cultural kind of feeling of that was a desexualization that was going along. And it was very interesting that he didn't choose sibling, or he didn't choose like, I don't know, he chose auntie, and this idea, exactly as you just said, that it's both an aging term, but it's one that is kind of also kind of desexualized. So I found that links in a way this very interesting moment of licking in the film that you're talking about, that there is this kind of, I don't know, erotic or kind of ambiguously sex adjacent act, which feels now even more subversive that we've kind of taken this quite non-academic route back to it. Kinkship. Thank you, Ted. That's great. And that was more of a comment rather than a kind of question there, but it was making me think about that totally. But yeah. I'm just so aware of time, and I really feel like we could go on and on and on, but I
find this so much. I think that we should all have like I was going to say a podcast, but maybe I don't know, some kind of platform. I'm not sure. This is just amazing. I'm loving hearing you guys talking. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I think we're going to round it up. I just think in the interests of what we advertised and not kind of not stealing people's.
I was thinking about Jenny having to edit this as well, and so yeah, maybe we should end there. But really, thank you guys so much. And it's a shame we can't all be in person together. But also on the other hand, it's nice that we've been able to kind of have this online kind of platform. But really, just two really honestly mind-blowing talks, and some of the most amazing things that I've heard in such a long time. And really refreshing, and two such different perspectives. So thank you so much for expanding our conceptions of care and beyond our wildest dreams. Really, thank you so much.